Hello, welcome to my latest photography tutorial. This is the first one I've created that isn't in my back garden. We're in my local cinema car park. I brought it here because it's a really bright day and we've got the sun shining down on me, and this tutorial is all going to be about light, and it's all going to be about how light hits an object, how light hits a landscape, how light works in a studio. We're just going to have a little bit of a summary of light, and these are the ideas that are in my head when I'm out there photographing the landscape, so I hope they're helpful to you. And it's all about the position of light. Here I'm stood in the middle of a car park and that sun's hit me from the side, so it's kind of defining me and giving me a bit of shape. If that sun was to be from that direction, it would be hit me straight on and look very different. So I'm going to talk about that and show some different examples of that. And I think light and how you play with it is absolutely at the heart of all good photography. And that might be street photography, studio photography, landscape photography. It's really important to have a feel for light and how to get the best from it, how to get real sort of drama. It's always good to have your eyes open for interesting mixes of light you've never expected. That's why it's so good to have a camera with you all the time, because you can just get these magic moments where a little bit of mist rolls in and the light clips through the trees. So having a feel for light, knowing how to make the most of it. There's things like when I'm out in the hills photographing, I'll know where the sun is, I'll be thinking about that, I'll be planning my day with that in mind. I'll be positioning myself so I know it's going to clip down some cliffs or the side of a hill. I'll be getting out of the shadows in the valley. I'm always kind of dancing around the light as it moves. So we're going to do a few things in this talk. We're going to do a little bit of a demo outside here where I move the camera around so you can see how the camera in relation to the position of the sun affects the object you're photographing. I'm also going to show a slideshow of images I've taken of the landscape where the position of the sunlight and how I've worked with the sun is really important. So I'll tell you what I've been thinking and what I was trying to achieve with those. Then we're going to take this indoors to a little studio setup, and I'm going to use a light and move that around an object as though I've got control of the sun, and we'll look at that object and how it gets defined in different ways. It will look flat when the light's right next to the camera. It will suddenly have definition when the light's to its size. It'll have loads of definition when the light's behind it, and I'll use that as a way of also doing a little bit of other sharing about studio photography, different types of light. And then at the end we're going to do a little bit about flash photography, on-camera flash, and how you can bounce that off the ceiling and just kind of make the most of what can be quite a kind of harsh source of light. So I hope it's useful. We're going to get on with the slideshow now, and then we're going to come back here. I'm going to show you what things look like as we move the camera in relation to the sun and how that changes an object.
So I've pulled this selection of images together because they're photographs where I've been really conscious of the position of light, where I've really worked hard to get the light in a certain position. This first one is very particular placement of the light. In fact, I think I planned my day around getting back to these rocks just as the sun was going down, because I knew they'd be really interesting when they were framed by the sunlight, and that little bit of sunlight clipping across the rocks would be really important. So often when I'm in the hills, like I was saying, it's all about timing, all about waiting for the light to move, trying to be in the right place at the right time. And here's at the other end of the day. This was at sunrise in the Peak District, and I got there very early, probably about half an hour before sunrise, and I knew again that this stream was going, behind me was the west and I was looking towards the east, so the sunrise is in the east. So by waiting there, I slowly saw the sunrise, and it aligned beautifully with this little gully, this little cut through created by a stream. Here's another in the Peak District near Grindleford and Haversedge. This really shows how the sun can define things in really interesting ways. So if you look at the foreground here, it's clipping the snow, it's creating these lovely highlights on the top of the snow and really defining it in a lovely way. And then you've got what the sunlight's doing as it comes through the trees, the beams of light bouncing off the stream. But yeah, I think I wanted to show this one because of the foreground area where you've got the snow and the textures because of the low winter sun. This one again is about positioning of the sun and being really conscious about how you position it. I loved this landscape. It almost looked like some kind of ceremonial altar or something like that, some piece of architecture. So I thought it'd be interesting to put the sun behind this kind of large tall rock, almost like something out of 2001 Space Odyssey. So I was deliberately putting it behind that. And also by putting it behind there, I was able to block some of the power of the sun. I was able to take some of the intensity of the light by having it slightly concealed behind the rock. So it helps me balance the light a little bit more by kind of almost using that rock as a baffle for the sunlight. Here's one similar to the snow image we just looked at, where that sun is clipping across the clouds and really defining them in a kind of very nicely shaped details. It's kind of clipping across them, and you've got that lovely sort of texture and shape to it, similar to the snow. Here's one towards the end of the day, walking in Snowdonia, where the sun had got so low and it was just cutting across the valley. It was creating these lovely beams of light. I did actually work into the beams of light a little bit in Photoshop to make them more intense, but there was this lovely flow of light across the hills, and again the mountain was kind of concealing the sun, or almost concealing it. So you've got this lovely balance of light and detail. You don't have that total flare of the sun in the image. Here's an urban image looking at Manchester at sunrise. So if you're going to play with the sun, you need to often be up early, capturing it on a really beautiful day. This was when it had just risen. There was a lot of mist beyond Manchester, and because it was so low, it was just clipping all the buildings really nicely and creating all these nice little bits of highlight, these bits where the sun bounced back into the camera. And another very early in the morning, this was flying towards a volcano in Iceland, and the sun was just coming up over the hills, and it was just lighting all this misty valley, capturing the light. And you can see certain places where the light has been cut away by the hills and the mountains. These are creating shadows, and there's shadows through the mist, and it's creating these lovely details. There's so much play of light going on in this image. It was incredible to see, but it was really lovely to sort of be able to document that from this little plain window. Here's one from Lud's Church, and again it's all about just waiting for timing. I think it's quite a big area, so I wandered around for quite a while, but I kept coming back to this one gully and waiting for the sun to slowly move around and capture some of that grass and bracken and light it in a really kind of interesting way, bring out the textures. Here's another with the light pushing through a tree, and you can almost see the way the light's pushing through the branches and the grass. You can get a sense of the direction of it, and these beams of light, everything's kind of radiating for the sun. And I really like the way that kind of curve of the tree and the way the sun sat within that curve. So you've got the definition that the sun's causing, but then you've also got the way it's kind of shaping the image is interesting, and the way it's fitting in the composition. Here's one that really is all about light. So this was getting near sunset from Ainsdale Beach, and it's all about how the light was capturing that water. As the sun got so low, you just get these little tiny highlights of intense light, and then the rest of it's reflecting the sky above. And then I think it was dark sky behind me, so some of the waves are catching that kind of darkness. So it's all about reflection, all about light. Here's a macro detail of a icicle dripping in Troller's Gill in the Yorkshire Dale. And we got there, and it's a really frosty morning, but then the sun slowly moved round, and as it moved round, the icicles suddenly set off dripping really quickly as they captured that heat and that warmth from the sunlight. So this is a moment where I just managed to capture the drip of the icicle as it was melting, and I positioned it so the sun was really backlighting the drip, backlighting the icicle, so it kind of really brings out the textures in this. Here's one where there's light bouncing everywhere. It was almost felt metallic. There was every surface on the grounds, the sea, the beach is reflective, so it almost looked metallic. So it's all about light, all about reflection. And you've even got a sundog in the sky to the right there, which is a kind of effect caused by the sun capturing light in the high clouds, or so reflecting in the high clouds, and you get these little spectrums of rainbow colours. Here's one early in the morning where the sun was rising just behind a dry stone wall. So by getting a low angle, by moving a bit of distance away, you could suddenly see almost like a cross section of the dry stone wall. You could see through it. By positioning the light behind, it turned it into a silhouette. This is one of a wind farm off the Suffolk coast. And sometimes light just does things that you can't predict. I think all the images I've shown you so far, light I've tried to time it, control it, be in the right place. But this one, I just saw this weather roll in while we were on a ship sailing back to Portsmouth, and suddenly there was heavy storms, and I was photographing that, and it was a big rainstorm. But then just as the sun dipped below what must have been the heavy clouds, there was a really intense sunset. So you had the silhouettes of the wind turbines, the reflections in the water, and this was just a chance. You probably could sail past this 100 more times and never ever see this combination of light and weather. So this is all about having your camera with you all the time to capture these perfect moments of light. Now we're going to have a look at a few iPhone photographs that I've taken, Again, this is about having a camera on you all the time so you can capture light as it puts these things in front of you that are unexpected. We're looking at a much softer light here than the photographs we've looked so far. It's a misty day, so all the light was diffused. The sunlight was diffused by the mist and the clouds, so everything's evenly lit. But that can still be quite dramatic. That can still have a nice feeling and atmosphere to it. This is the Jumbo Water Tower in Colchester. Really red brick, so the late afternoon sun really brought out that warmth and redness. But by waiting a little while, I could slowly get that lovely shadow on the middle bit and really get this interesting defined shape. Here we are in a modernist building in the UMIS site of Manchester. I knew the sun was going to catch these stairs eventually, so I kept going back. I was working on another project there, but I went back about 5 times. And eventually there was a point where the sun came straight down the stairs and clipped the tops of a lot of those stairs in front of you, and then created this lovely pool of light in front. And I think this is the point where the sun's coming exactly down the stairs. And I guess with architecture like this, it's all about precision and sharp lines and symmetry. So it's sometimes really interesting to then work with light in the same way, have the light adding to that symmetry and precision. Here's one in woods in Hampshire. Again, the sun's low at the end of the day, but it was just kind of clipping those telegraph poles and the wires and the trees, and it got lower to the ground. And there was a nice sort of combination with the intensity of the sun and then the intensity of those headlights on the car as well. But by shooting into the sun, you can just pick out such lovely defined details, and you get all these nice highlights and reflections once the sun's low and once you're shooting into it. Here's another iPhone one. This is the sun moving across a leaf. If you let the sun go across something and just skim it, you get really interesting and quite defined textures and shapes. So by positioning this so the sun just skimmed across it, you get that lovely kind of textures and shapes of the patterns on the leaf. Here's one at sunrise, getting down really low. And you can do interesting things with the light. This one I've deliberately positioned that grass so it cuts into the sun. Similar to that rock one we looked at earlier, where I used it, the sun hidden behind the rock. But you can get really interesting effects and low angles, and at sunrise and sunset there tends to be a lot less power in the sun, so you can shoot right into it, and things don't get overwhelmed by that brightness, which can be useful. And also you get a bit of mist in the air, a bit of fog, and suddenly you see the shape of light, the way it cuts through the air. This one you see those lines of light coming through the mist, through the trees. Now, the last couple we're going to look at are using studio lighting. So this is one I did for a commission for the BBC Philharmonic. It was for a concert of the Firebird, Stravinsky's The Firebird. So I worked with a dancer, and she studied the music. She's called Claire Fields, and used some of the dance moves from a performance of a ballet to Firebird. And I deliberately lit it so it looked like a film called The Red Shoes, a Powell and Pressburger film. I think it was from the 50s. So I deliberately treated the colours and the lighting like it was from that film. But this was through very careful positioning of light. You've got a directional spotlight from the top left, and that's hitting the dancer, that's hitting Claire. And it's really showing the detail on her arms, on her head, and it just really brings out texture. But then I would have used some fill-in lights as well, so the shadows didn't become too heavy. But it's really good if you've got studio lights, you can really control the kind of feel of lighting and create really cinematic looking photographs. And a final one, this is one of my composite images. Lots of elements in this were photographed outside, so the trees and the gunneras and the rock and the smoke. But then the dinosaurs, the pterodons and the Allosaurus and the Brachiosaurus, were all shot in my studio, and I was able to match the lighting. So for all the shots, even the outdoor ones, the indoor ones, I picked where the sun would be, and everything I lit, the sun was coming from that same direction. So when I had the dinosaurs in the studio, I used studio lighting and had them clipped as though the sun was hitting them from that same point. So it can be quite useful in composite photography as well, because you can match in the lighting, and with composite photography, lighting is so key to getting it right. And keep an eye on the Brachiosaurus in the distance there. That's going to turn up later in this tutorial as well. I've used that as a demo to show positions of light. So I hope that's been useful. That's some of the images where light has been really key. I do a lot of this shooting into the sunlight, shooting directly into the brightness of light. Now that can be a little bit tricky. That's when you really get defined images, but it can be a bit tricky. So there is another tutorial on my playlist, which I'll put a link to in the comments in the description of this video, and that tells you how to blend exposures. So that allows you to shoot into the light and get a nice level of detail next to the sun, and also a nice level of detail in the shadow areas. So I'll put a link to that, because that really helps you be able to shoot into sunlight, which is very useful when you're creating these images where the light's right in front of you.
Okay, so we're back in the abandoned cinema car park. I'm going to do a bit of a demonstration now of how the direction of the sun hitting the objects changes it, makes it look more or less 3D. So we're going to go to still photographs now, and I'm going to take the camera and I'm going to move it right around me in a circle. I'm going to stand right in the middle, and we're going to take lots of stills. And I'm going to keep facing the camera, and we're going to zoom in on me, and you'll see how that light moves around me as we move in relation. And this is something we're going to mimic in the studio as well. We're going to move a light around an object as well, because that's what's important. How a light strikes an object or landscape, that's kind of the heart of what we're looking here. So we're going to show that in a couple of different ways. So yeah, I hope this is useful. This will show how the camera in relation to the sun defines me in different ways and defines an object in different ways. Okay, I'm going to stand perfectly still.
So as you can see here, me and the camera are locked into the same position. So I'm facing the camera each time. We're spinning around, so effectively the main thing that's changing is the direction of light, the direction the light is hitting me. So you can see that as we spin around, it defines me in different ways. As the sunlight's on the side, it kind of creates more shape. As the sunlight's hitting me from the front, it can look quite flat. And if you look at the shadow on the floor, you can kind of get an idea of where the sunlight's hitting me from. So we're going to move in a little bit closer now. And if you look there, there's some points when it looks quite flat and hasn't got much shape, and then suddenly there'll be points where it's a bit more 3D looking. And that's usually when the light source is behind the subject or the object. So we're just going to get rid of the background now, so it just goes straight down to me, and you can just think about the light as it hits me. And that light is still moving around, but I'm now going to pause it in 4 different positions. So if we pause it here, the sunlight is hitting me directly from the front. So this is like if you had a light on your camera. So there's no shape particularly, it's just hitting it flat on. You can't particularly see shadows. It's quite a flat image. Now we're going to make it spin again. And as it spins, we're going to stop it with the light coming from the left-hand side. And as you can see there, it's got a bit more shape now. It's got shadow on the edge of my face. It's got highlights on one side. Everything starts to look a bit more 3D. And now if you let it spin again and we make it so the shadow is coming from the right-hand side, you can see that similar definition to the previous time we stopped it. It's got a lot of shape when it's coming from the side. And now if we let it spin again and we let it so the sunlight almost goes from directly behind me, you can see a really nice amount of shape. And you can go from directly behind objects, and sometimes you get these really nice halos and things. So I just wanted to show this because it shows that just moving the light source around an object or a landscape just shows it in such different ways, and occasionally it will define it perfectly. There's no one rule. It's not always perfect to have the light exactly at the side of an object. You could have it further behind, and sometimes on a grey day when you have got very flat light hitting a subject, that can look okay as well. But it's good to be aware that the position that the light is coming from is so important for defining an object or landscape, and that definition really adds to the atmosphere, the feel of a photograph. If it's something so well defined because you've got the light perfect, it can really jump off a print, or when you see it online it can look great. So yeah, just think about that when you're out photographing. And the last few spins, we're now going to go inside and we're going to look at light position in the studio and how you can control the shape of an object by moving a light around it. So hopefully that will be useful. We're also going to look at some studio lighting techniques.
So we're in the studio now. We're using light in a different way. Out on location, often the light is in fixed positions. You've got the sun, wherever it is, it's staying in that same place. It does slowly move through the sky, but you have to, when you're on location, move your position relative to the sunlight. So the object you're photographing or the landscape or the hills are defined in different ways. Now that is all switched on its head when you come inside the studio, because in the studio you can position your lights wherever you want. So I've just pulled out this little LED panel here as an example because it's battery powered, so I can circle the entire object without getting tangled up in cables or anything. And we can see as I circle it with light, very much the same way I showed you in the car park, the object is defined in different ways. So we'll start with light firing straight into it from almost directly at the camera. If I just lower the light there, you can see it's almost from the point of view of the camera, and that is the point of view where you don't really see many shadows because it's been hit so face on. There's no relief to it because it doesn't have highlights or shadows. It's just, you're just seeing that flat light on it. But then if we slowly move the light source around it, the LED panel, you can see it's defined in all sorts of different ways. So you can see there it's clipping it in nice ways. You're seeing textures, and you can work with the height of that light as well. You can go very low to the ground or very high to the ground. You've got so much creative control now over that point of light, what it does, the angle it hits it as. You can put this light wherever you want. You can define it whatever way you want. You can try low and high. You can go directly from above and get some really unusual light. You can backlight it. We were talking about the sun hitting objects from behind and clip it in interesting ways. So this is, we've looked at available light, which is light outdoors. This is artificial light where you have all that control and you can create some really interesting effects. You can just have tons of fun with it. We're going to spend a bit more time exploring artificial light now. I'm going to show you a very basic free light studio setup, 2 soft boxes and a directional light, and how you can light an object on a tabletop. But these ideas can be extended to lighting room sets, lighting outdoors when you're maybe at night when you've got some light. It's the same ideas apply, that you've got a directional light that's kind of like a spotlight, and then fill-in lights. That's the very basics of studio photography lighting. So we'll have a look at that now, and I'll give you a bit of a demonstration of how I work in the studio and how I think about that. So we're now going to have a quick look at a very simple studio lighting setup using free lights. I'm using these lights, which are flashlights, but they've also got modelling lights. Modelling lights are lights that are on constantly. It's like a tungsten bulb in the middle of that, and it helps you get the position of your light correctly because you can constantly see what that's doing. But then when you're ready to do the photograph, you can start using the flash, which is when you see a pop of light like that. You can actually shoot with just your modelling light. Sometimes I like to do that because if I've got my camera on a tripod, I can do quite a long exposure. But basically what you do first is you position your free lights so that the object looks good using the modelling lights. And then after that, you start working with the flash and the power of the flash and getting the ratios right between those free lights. So I usually start with what I call my directional light, which is like that spotlight, which is where you've got an intense amount of light coming from a very small area. And because it's coming from a small area, you get very defined shadows, very sharp light hitting it. Whereas we're going to look at soft lights in a second, and that's where you get very soft shadows and a very kind of general light hitting it. So I tend to get my directional light looking good first. So let me just move that around a little bit. So it's clipping the dinosaur. I'm going to play with the height a little bit, get it looking like that so it's got a nice shadow, and then I'll check that from camera a few times. I quite like that. I think maybe it could have a bit more light on the actual head of the dinosaur, so I'll just rotate my subject a little bit and bring that round. I think that's looking okay. You can do other things. If you've got a directional light, you can use what's known as diffuser material, and you can put that over the light and you can make a slightly softer directional light. You can use bulldog clips to do that. It takes a little bit of power out of it, and also it means those shadows that are coming from it aren't quite as sharp and defined. In this case, I really want those shadows lovely and sharp, so I'm not going to use that diffuser material. I'm just going to use the direct light coming from there. So we've got directional light positioned. I'm liking the look of that. Now we're going to move on to soft light. Now I have 2 ways I can light this. There is this umbrella here. Let me turn that on. At the moment it's facing the wrong direction, but basically with a umbrella, you've got all this light hitting that big white space and bouncing back into the object. So I spin this round now, try and not knock anything over. And all that light is, instead of coming from a very sharp point as it was over there from that directional light in the background. It's coming from a very large area, so it's a very general soft light. And the same goes for this light, which I'm going to start using now. This is known as a softbox, and it has light, instead of coming from that tight area that you get on this light here, it comes from this entire large, almost 2 meter square area. So it hits the object and you don't get a sharp shadow from it. So let me just position this and show you the effect it has. I'll point that at my object, fix it, bring it down a little bit, and just adjust the height. Okay, that is good. So what's happening is this light here is producing a very directional sharp light, very defined highlights, a very sharp shadow. And then these two soft lights, the umbrella that I use first and then the softbox that I use second, are just taking some of the darkness out of the shadow area. These areas here where it gets really dark and this area where the shadow is there. But because there's such a broad area of general light coming from a big kind of area, you don't get defined shadows from the softbox, you don't get defined shadows from that because it's just a very general, very soft light. Imagine this light here being like the sunlight on a sunny day where it's hitting you, everything's very defined, you've got sharp shadows. These two lights here are like sunlight, or well, like the light from the sun on a very cloudy day where you have an overcast sky and that sunlight is hitting all that cloud above and it's just sending it very, very softly down, so nothing has sharp shadows. That's what these lights do here. There's no sharp shadows from here. It's just a very kind of general light from those. This is a little bit of a strange way of thinking about it, but I had this moment when I was working in a photographic studio where it really clicked, being able to visualize light and how light works. I kind of thought of the idea of a light source almost being this thing that fires out hundreds of little balls, almost like a multi-dimensional or three-dimensional pool balls, kind of firing out of that. And once you start visualizing that, all these balls coming out, then you start thinking, what's that object going to do to them? Because it's coming from a tight space, you've got that condensed beam of kind of balls. Lots of them are going to catch there, lots of them are going to land here, but because it's coming from a tight space, they're not going to spread out that much. They're going to stay quite close amongst these shadows. So that's what that light's going to do. But then if we start thinking of the softbox in the same way, then firing all these bits of balls, all these particles of light through space towards the object. Now here you've got lots and lots of particles coming from a very wide area, a very general area. So they're just kind of hitting it, and they're not creating any defined shadows because it's coming from such a wide area. So some of those balls will be of light, those points of light will be really soft by the point they're there. So it's hard to explain, and I've probably done a really bad job of explaining it, but that's how I kind of visualize light in a studio, of this big multi-dimensional kind of game of pool almost, of light coming from objects in different ways, from a very general way, so just kind of drifting over it, from a very sharp way, so having very defined shadows. And that helps me sort of visualize what's going on in a studio and make my creative decisions. So I hope that's useful. Just a couple of last things. Sometimes I like to use 4 points of light. I've not got 4 flashlights. I just want to demonstrate this. You could have a little bit of light clipping it. Let me just change the color of that. From this side to bring a bit of definition there, but then you get these weird shadows here. But if you put that light at quite a low angle there, just so it kind of clips it and creates highlights, but no shadow because it's at the same level as the tabletop, you get some nice definition without an extra shadow. So sometimes a 4th light from behind can be quite handy. Another couple of quick things that are really useful. If your directional light, the very sharp one in the background, is right behind the object, sometimes you get a lot of lens flare, and that can really mess up the image because it gets kind of faded looking. You don't get pure blacks. So I often use something that's known as a flag baffle to take some power out of that light. So this is a flag baffle, if I can get hold of it, and it's just a piece of card on a couple of bulldog clips that are attached, and you can just put that on a stand and you can just carefully position it so that that light, none of that directional light in the background is going into the lens and creating lens flare, or meaning you don't have an image that's defined. Another last thing is something that's actually more powerful than you'd imagine, more useful than you'd imagine, and that is reflectors. The idea that you can reflect light back into it. So let me turn these soft lights off for a second, and I'll show you the effect this has. So this is just a simple white piece of mount board. If I put that there, quite near the object, you can see that it's bouncing light back into it. It's meaning those shadows aren't quite as deep. If I move it away, you can see quite quickly that it makes a little bit of difference. Not a massive amount, but sometimes it's a good way of not having to have lights everywhere. You can use a bit of mirror or some other way of just bringing that little bit of definition into it. And that's also useful outside. You see a lot of kind of model photography shoots going on where the assistant will be kind of just out of shot, bouncing the sunlight into them. So you don't get such heavy, dark, solid shadows. You get kind of much softer shadows. And you can get reflectors that are silvery, which bounce even more light back in. So yeah, this is a very general light setup. These same ideas apply to portrait photography, obviously kind of still life photography, room sets. If you're lighting an outdoor space, sometimes you might have a totally pitch black outdoor space doing a night shoot. You would light it with the same kind of ideas in mind, soft lights, directional lights. It also works for video as well. So you might have a similar 3 light setup for little video shoots, like talking head type stuff. I'm just going to show you one last thing that's part of this, which is how to get the ratios right between the 3 lights. So this is how we get the power correct, because at the moment, the only light we've seen is light that's created by the modeling lights, whereas these lights are actually flashlights. So we've got the directional light at the back and the 2 soft boxes here, the 2 soft lights. So I'm just going to turn the soft lights off, and usually what I do is, I'm going to start taking photographs on this. So there we are. We start seeing how the directional light's looking. I'd say we view the image, that's looking incredibly bright, way too bright. We don't need anything like that brightness. So I'm going to change my power on this directional light right down to a much lower one. Let me just see how that's looking. We'll take a picture. That is looking much better now. Oh, quite blue actually. So let me just sort my white bounce out. So I'll put that onto flash setting. I'm not going into too much detail on the studio lighting, but hopefully, okay, that's looking good now. I like the highlight, and now I slowly work my way through the 2 softer lights and see how the power of those affects it. So let me just take a quick picture of that. This is with the softbox on, and preview it. Now that is incredibly bright, so I know I can take loads of power out of this softbox. And we'll see how that's looking. It's still looking a tad bright, so I'll just take a little bit more out of it, because I like that strong highlight and direction from the light in the background. Now that's looking good. And then this softbox here, I know I don't need much extra power from this one because it's already looking fine. So I'm going to, just for an example, I'll do the first one with that on full power. You can see that's totally bleached out, but I know that I can put that really low and take a picture. Still a little bit too bright. Let's make that a tiny bit darker. And there we go. I like the shape of that. The textures are really nice because we've got that directional light hitting it, creating a really nice highlight. But then I'm not letting the shadows go too dark because I've got the soft boxes on, which are just filling that, pumping a little bit of light into those shadow areas and bringing out nice textures. So that's a very basic studio lighting setup. Like I say, we're using 3 points of light. We're using this directional light there, a softbox and an umbrella. Both of those virtually do the same thing. They create a very broad kind of general soft light that hits the object, and this creates that directional light. We're going to do one last thing. I'm going to do a quick demonstration of a handy thing you can do with on-camera flash, the flash that sits on top of your camera, how you can make that a little bit softer. So yeah, we'll go and have a look at that now. So we're going to quickly look now at on-camera flash. That's when you have the flash guns that sit directly on the top of your camera. Now the light from these can sometimes be incredibly harsh because that light source is from quite a small spot, so very directional, and also right next to the lens, so you don't see any shadow. It's that idea of the light coming from more or less where you are, where everything looks very flat. You'll know if you've taken pictures on a smartphone camera where you've got the light exactly where the lens is almost. Everything looks very bleached out, people's faces look very white. So I'm going to show you a couple of techniques on how to get the most out of these, how to use some ways of kind of softening that light a bit and making it a bit more sympathetic on the subject. And speaking of subject, I'm using my son's Brachiosaurus. I've decided to use this because it's got lovely sort of textures to it, which I thought when you've got light hitting, it's defined in interesting ways. So moving over to my camera, the flash is on, it's set up. I'm using a TTL setting. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how these lights, these on-camera flashes work, because there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to control. I'm just going to show you a general idea. So just quickly cutting into the video here, I've just been editing it and I've noticed I used an acronym there. I used TTL. I've really wanted to make these tutorials free of kind of photography speak and free of acronyms and things that you have to know about to kind of access. I want them to be open to anyone, so I've been trying to make them as plain English as possible. But TTL stands for through the lens metering. So that's when the flash talks to the camera. So when you're taking the picture, it's a very clever system. When you're taking the picture, the mirror comes up, the lens is open, and it takes a meter reading. And when it sees that enough light has come in the lens from the flash, it shuts the flash off. So it's all about the communication between the camera and the flash. Usually you have to have a camera and a flash of the same brand, so Canon or Nikon, and they have this way of talking and way of communicating. But yeah, it's through the lens metering. It's kind of like an automatic way of metering. You don't have to go in and manually set it. It makes that decision itself. So yeah, I just wanted to go into that because I shouldn't assume that people know what these things mean. So I try and make things as clear as possible. Okay, back to the actual film. So if I take a picture now with the flash hitting straight at the object, it looks very harsh. It's got no shape to it. It's kind of like almost blinded by the light. You've got this big intense burst of light right in the face of it. But we can change that. We're in a space here which I've chosen. It's my wife's studio, which has got a nice white ceiling and nice white walls. So I can take that intense burst of light that's coming from a really small area, and by pointing it directly up at the ceiling, that light, which is coming out of here like that, suddenly hits the ceiling there, about that sort of width perhaps, and you've suddenly got this big soft pool of light, kind of like a softbox or an umbrella that we used in the studio, and that soft pool of light is going down on it and it's creating much less harsh shadows, and also importantly it's taking the light source away from being really close to the camera to being up here and down lighting it, so suddenly you do see shadows and you do see highlights. So let me take a quick picture of that. And that's looking a lot more sympathetic. It's got a nice character to it, a real softness to the light. And that's all that idea of you taking that intense, very defined area of light and suddenly turning it into a soft light, like a softbox. And that's really useful when you've got white ceilings. And also it's offset, it's not on the camera, the light's not coming from near the lens. A lot of event photographers or wedding photographers pray for white ceilings and white walls because you can go somewhere, it might be quite dark, but you know if it's got white ceilings, you can bounce your light off it. You can kind of create a nice soft light that's it's got a nice character to it. As well as swiveling up and down, these flashes often swivel sideways. So I'd be stood here thinking, okay, what can I do? And I see there's a white wall there. That could be a nice reflector, a soft reflector of light. So I can bounce this light into there and take a quick picture. And suddenly you've got a soft light because it's bouncing off this large area, not coming from that defined area. And it's coming from the side as well. So you've got a higher light down the left side of the Brachiosaurus and shadows on the right, and suddenly it's got a much nicer character, and that can be really useful. So, and you can even use a combination of the two. You can kind of use this area here, so you've got light bouncing off of the ceiling and the wall, and it's very general, and it just gives it a much nicer character than that really harsh light that shines directly onto it. I mean, so a lot of photographers do use that technique a lot. sometimes that harshness can be quite appealing as well. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with this tutorial. I wanted to let you know that light is a really important creative tool, whether that's available light outside in the sunlight or a studio light where you can control everything. You can position lights, you can have 100 lights on an object, you can have the power on each one of those controllable, or on-camera flash. You can use that in a variety of ways. There's so many things just in this little unit here that you can control and do. So light is really important. I think light, composition and colour are such important things, more important than any camera you could ever buy. Having an understanding for light, that idea that you're outside and you're waiting for the light to move, you're moving yourself in relation to the sun and the object. Light is so important, and knowing it's something that is up for grabs, you can play with it, you can use it to make your photographs look amazing, is really important. So I hope this has been a useful tutorial. There's lots more tutorials on the playlist, so subscribe if you like. There's more to follow. I'm going to do a night photography one soon. I'm going to do another one looking at lenses, how different lenses can pick up resolution and detail the world in such a variety of ways. And then I'm going to do some more. I've got lots more subjects I want to cover, so hopefully these will all form a really nice course which will all tie together, and just by these tutorials I'm putting together will give you a real way into photography. So, but if you've got any subjects you'd like me to cover or any questions related to photography, please get in touch. I'm always happy to help where I can. Yeah, and I hope this has been a useful tutorial. Thanks for watching.